April 17, 1944. 14,000 feet above Kassel, Germany. The temperature outside was minus 38 degrees. The cockpit canopy glistened with ice crystals. Below, fields and forests blurred into a single frozen canvas. Inside a dimly lit radio operations room at the Altenstadt Air Base, 27-year-old engineer Friedrich Köhler adjusted the dials of a German FUG-16ZY transceiver. His fingers trembled not from fear, but from cold and fatigue. He had been monitoring Allied frequencies for weeks, searching for a pattern, a weakness, a delay. But what he heard that morning changed everything. It was a voice, not loud, not aggressive, calm, precise, an American pilot relaying coordinates, confirming altitude, requesting formation shift. Every syllable came through without static, as if the man were standing in the room. No distortion, no interference, just clarity, impossibly clear. Friedrich leaned closer to the receiver, his breath fogging the lens of his glasses, double-checked the frequency. It was real. The Americans were not shouting. They weren't panicking. They weren't guessing. They were speaking with confidence, moving as one, executing commands like a machine with 100 limbs and a single brain. It wasn't what they said that shocked him. It was how they said it. Like the sky belonged to them. Friedrich took off his headphones. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. He simply stared ahead and muttered, almost inaudibly, "We've lost." He wasn't alone in thinking that. Across the Luftwaffe's technical divisions, whispers were spreading, rumors of Allied coordination beyond comprehension, of bombers that flew in grids so tight they seemed choreographed, of fighter escorts that never left formation, no matter how deep into German airspace they ventured. The Allies weren't just winning the war in the skies, they were organizing it, and the secret wasn't just in their machines, it was in their voices. For years, German engineers took pride in their precision. Their machines were marvels of metallurgy and math, but precision meant nothing if your message never reached its target. While German pilots struggled with range limitations and poor signal quality, American aircraft were equipped with VHF radios that operated with astonishing efficiency. Pilots could speak to each other over long distances, change formations mid-flight, reroute, call for backup, or abort missions in real time. No delays, no confusion, just action. The difference wasn't just technical, it was psychological. German pilots entered combat already at a disadvantage, isolated by silence and static. American pilots, on the other hand, entered as part of a hive mind. Every command received, every order executed, every voice a thread in a web of air power stretching from England to Berlin. What haunted Friedrich most wasn't the technology, it was the tone. That calm voice carried no urgency, no desperation. It was the voice of someone who had already won. And deep down, the Luftwaffe's most brilliant minds understood something they could never say out loud. The war would not be lost in the factories, it would be lost in the air. And the first sign of that defeat was not a bomb, but a whisper. Months later, after the war, Allied interrogators would ask captured German engineers, when they realized their side was losing. One of them would respond, without hesitation, "The first time we heard one of your radios, that was the day we knew." It was not a myth. It was not an exaggeration. It was the honest confession of men who had spent years believing in their own superiority, only to be undone by something they never thought to fear. The voice of a young American pilot, floating across the airwaves, more powerful than any bullet. It's strange to think how many wars are lost not in moments of fire and steel, but in quiet realizations, in moments where pride is broken not by force, but by clarity, where empires begin to crack not under bombardment but under the weight of a single undeniable truth, that the enemy is not just better equipped, he is better connected. Friedrich never forgot that morning. He would later say that hearing that voice was like watching the future overtake the present. One second the Germans were masters of the sky, the next, they were ghosts, floating inside machines that no longer ruled the air, their radios filled with static, their formations scattered, their confidence shattered. There is a kind of defeat that doesn't come with explosions or smoke, a defeat that arrives quietly, almost politely, wrapped in a calm voice and a flawless signal. That morning the Luftwaffe's fate was sealed not by a dogfight or a bombing run, but by a sound, a voice, a signal too perfect to ignore. That was the moment everything changed, and it had nothing to do with guns. If this story made you feel something, if you're the kind of person who sees history not as names and dates, but as lives and moments, consider subscribing to this channel and leaving a comment. Your voice matters here, just like his voice did up there. It was never meant to be a weapon, at least not in the traditional sense. It didn't explode, it didn't tear through steel, it didn't burn skin or ignite engines. And yet, inside every American bomber, every Mustang slicing across the sky, and every cockpit that danced over the clouds of Europe. It sat, small, silent, unassuming, until it spoke. And when it did, it rewired the war, the radio, not just a tool for communication, not just a convenience. In the Allied arsenal, it became something far greater. It was a tactical advantage, a psychological edge, a symbol of unity in a sky fractured by chaos. For the German command, it was a growing mystery. For the pilots on the ground, it was something they couldn't see, couldn't touch, but they could feel it, because every time they encountered American aircraft, the result was the same. Fast reaction, perfect coordination, a strange, almost ghost-like awareness of the battlefield. The Luftwaffe had radios too. Of course they did. The Germans were not primitive. In fact, they were brilliant. Their engineers had developed some of the finest aircraft the world had ever seen. Their pilots were seasoned, often with hundreds of missions under their belts. But all of that brilliance, all of that experience, was built on a system that had begun to crack, and the fracture line ran straight through the airwaves. German aircraft typically used high-frequency and early VHF systems like the few G-16 series. They were solid, reliable in theory, but in practice they were hindered by short-range, interference, and the unavoidable chaos of real combat conditions. Ground crews would spend hours tuning frequencies trying to ensure their pilots could communicate, only to discover mid-mission that their words were being swallowed by atmospheric distortion. More than once, pilots flew into combat relying entirely on visual cues and guesswork. It was war by instinct, not by coordination. Meanwhile, the Americans were flying with the SCR-522, a VHF marvel adapted from British designs but enhanced with American production power. It was light, durable, and mass-produced in staggering numbers. But more importantly, it worked. Always. Pilots could speak to each other over 30 to 50 miles without static. And they weren't just broadcasting blind. They were using designated channels for squadrons, command, relays, and even emergency response. The radio became their map, their compass, and their heartbeat. One B-17 crewman described it like this: "It was like having eyes in the back of your head. You always knew what was happening, even if you couldn't see it. The sky talked to us." In the chaos of battle, that mattered more than anyone on the ground could understand. A pilot flying at 400 miles per hour had seconds to react to threats, seconds to change course, seconds to survive. With radio clarity, those seconds multiplied. Orders came instantly. Warnings spread faster than bullets. A commander's voice could prevent a disaster before it began. But it wasn't just the mechanics, it was the mentality. The Americans trained for communication as a core skill. Instructors didn't just teach how to fly or shoot. They drilled pilots on brevity codes, on tone, on when to speak and when to listen. Each voice on the radio was trained to convey maximum information with minimum noise. Clarity was survival. Clarity was dominance. And that clarity had consequences. German pilots began to notice. Some described it as unnatural, others called it unfair. In debriefings after failed interceptions, Luftwaffe veterans often cited the same strange observation. The Americans always seemed to know more. Where to be, when to strike, when to vanish, as if they weren't flying alone, but plugged into something larger, something alive. That something was the network. The Allies had created a decentralized yet deeply connected battlefield. Every pilot was a node, every voice a signal, and through those signals came an invisible advantage that no engine or armor could match. It wasn't just the voice of one man, it was the voice of the system. There's a recorded instance from the Normandy campaign, where an American P-47 flight was diverted mid-air from one target to another, based solely on real-time radio updates. The original mission had become irrelevant within minutes. The skies changed, orders changed. The strike team changed course without confusion or delay. German spotters watched in disbelief as the squadron turned in perfect formation and struck a different rail line, one that had been rebuilt just hours earlier. The German response was too slow. By the time they reacted, the thunderbolts were already gone. What had just happened was impossible under the German system. The Luftwaffe could not redirect in real time. Their communication structure was built for planned missions, not dynamic response. To change targets required paperwork, signatures, a chain of command. In the sky, it meant delay. And in 1944, delay meant defeat. Even more unsettling for German pilots was the tone of the American transmissions. Calm, controlled. There was no yelling, no panic, just instructions, confirmation, a pause, then action. It was the tone of someone who had time. And time in war is a luxury that often costs blood. The Luftwaffe began to fear the sound itself. Not the roar of engines or the rattle of machine guns, but that calm American voice. crackling in through captured radios or bleeding through open frequencies. It was the sound of precision, the sound of a system that worked, the sound of control. Some German engineers in the final months of the war tried to replicate the Allied advantage. They improved frequency hopping. They tested new encryption. They built better microphones. But it was too late. What the Allies had wasn't just technology. It was culture. A culture of preparation, clarity, and adaptability. The radio wasn't just a device, it was doctrine. One technician from the Luftwaffe later wrote, "We thought radios were just tools. They thought radios were soldiers." In that sentence lies the truth of 1,000 defeats. The Allies saw every part of their system as a weapon. Not just the guns, not just the planes, but the voice that moved units, that warned of ambushes, that called for help, that confirmed victory. And the more that voice echoed across Europe, the more it cracked the illusion of German superiority. Because in every message, every phrase, every calm instruction, there was something deeper, an unspoken truth that no countermeasure could silence. We are ready, we are united, and we are coming. If this glimpse into the power of communication opened your eyes to a different kind of warfare, let us know your thoughts in the comments. And if you believe that history is not just about what happened, but about how and why, you're in the right place. Subscribe and join us as we keep uncovering the untold frequencies of the past. The German mind revered the masterpiece. Every bolt, every curve, every cockpit dial was a reflection of obsession. Aircraft like the Focke-Wulf 190 and the Messerschmitt Bf 109 weren't just machines. They were flying expressions of precision, decades ahead in aerodynamics and lethality. Engineers in Dresden and Augsburg labored over individual fuel pumps, over piston tolerances measured in microns. They believed war could be won with ingenuity. They believed superiority was mechanical. But war is not a contest of genius. It is a contest of production. By late 1943, that truth had begun to bleed through the arrogance. While German engineers were calibrating new superchargers to squeeze a few more knots of speed from their latest prototype, the Americans were pushing thousands of P-47 Thunderbolts out of assembly lines every month, each one nearly identical. Each one arriving with replacement parts, trained mechanics, and a pilot whose mission was backed by entire rail systems and fuel convoys. There is a famous story of a P-47 returning from a mission with one wing half gone, riddled with flak holes, oil bleeding from the engine, and the radio still functional. The pilot landed it. It was patched, repainted, and airborne again in 48 hours. Not because the plane was perfect, but because it was designed for that. To be durable, to be fixable, to return. The Germans, meanwhile, had jewels in the sky. Temperamental jewels, fragile jewels. Planes that flew beautifully when everything worked, but that required entire ground teams just to stay functional. One broken part could ground a fighter for weeks. One missing shipment could silence a squadron. And the deeper Germany descended into the war, the more those missing shipments turned from problem into prophecy. American aircraft were not works of art. They were tools, built for function, not praise. The P-51 Mustang didn't win beauty contests in German pilot lounges, but it did fly from England to Berlin and back. With a full escort, the B-17 Flying Fortress was not sleek, it was brutal. It could fly on 3 engines, sometimes on 2, sometimes on 1. Its goal was not elegance, its goal was completion. Behind each American pilot stood a machine, not just the aircraft, but the factory, the refinery, the railroad, the schoolhouse that trained him, the technician who soldered his radio, the woman in Michigan who riveted his wing. The United States had created not just a military force, but an industrial organism, one that grew stronger every week because it was fed by something Germany could never match: scale. In 1944, American factories produced nearly 100,000 aircraft. Germany managed less than 40,000, and for every German pilot trained, 5 Americans were learning the skies. 5 more radios, 5 more planes, 5 more flights into the heart of the Reich. Inside Luftwaffe Command, that number wasn't just a statistic, it was a sentence. They began to understand they were fighting a hydra. Kill 1 squadron, 2 more arrived. Bomb 1 runway, another was paved. Shoot down a bomber crew, and a fresh one stood ready the next morning, trained to the same standard, speaking the same codes, following the same doctrine. What made it worse was that German production, for all its intelligence, was never built for replacement. It was built for perfection. You don't replace perfection, you repair it, you conserve it. But when your entire war depends on fragile brilliance, and your enemy's war depends on reliable abundance, you are not in the same fight. One German engineer, captured in the final days of the war, confessed under interrogation, We were building violins. They were building hammers. And hammers win wars. There's an eerie symbolism in the way Luftwaffe strategy clung to custom solutions. When faced with Allied bombers that flew too high, Germany didn't mass-produce countermeasures. They designed experimental aircraft with rocket propulsion. When radar interference became a problem, they developed intricate jamming devices that required custom installation. Each time the problem shifted, they tried to outthink it. The Americans didn't outthink it. They outbuilt it. Need better bombing accuracy? Train thousands of bombardiers with identical manuals. Need more parts? Build plants that operate 24 hours a day. Need more radios? Convert car radio factories into military production overnight. There was no hesitation, no romanticism, no delay, just movement, just action. And that movement became the death spiral of German resistance, because no matter how fast a German aircraft could fly or how tightly it could turn, it could not outrun the weight of industrial inevitability. By mid-1944, Luftwaffe fighter wings were being outnumbered in every engagement, not slightly, massively, 10-1, 15-1. Every mission became a gamble, every flight a farewell. German ground crews watched helplessly as their pilots took off into skies they knew they could not control, because control required more than skill. It required presence, and presence came from logistics, from fuel, from radios, from airplanes that didn't need to be perfect, just available. The silence that followed many of those takeoffs wasn't just radio static. It was grief. It was fatigue. It was the understanding that no amount of talent could compensate for absence. And inside the engineering halls where dreams of innovation once soared, only quiet remained, because the men who designed the best aircraft of their time had come face to face with a truth their equations had never accounted for. The war would not be won by inventing the future. It would be won by delivering the present, over and over again, on time, in force. If this story made you think differently about what really wins a war, share your thoughts in the comments. And if you want to explore more of the hidden truths behind the machines and minds of World War II, subscribe and stay with us. Sometimes, understanding the past is not about the weapon that fired, but the system that loaded it. By 1944, the war had entered a new dimension, a dimension that couldn't be seen, touched, or even fully understood by those still measuring power by bombs and bullets. It moved in silence. It drifted through the sky like smoke, invisible, but everywhere. The Germans had underestimated it. They were fighting in the air, but the Allies were already fighting in the ether. What began as simple communication had evolved into something far more dangerous, control of the unseen battlefield. For the Allies, dominance in the air wasn't just about flying higher or faster. It was about hearing better, speaking clearer, and eventually, confusing the enemy before a shot was even fired. The Luftwaffe, built on doctrine from the early 1930s, still believed in the supremacy of the pilot, individual skill, tactical brilliance, visual range. But the Americans had moved on. Their new weapon was electromagnetic. Their new front line was frequency. And without even realizing it, the Germans were being surrounded. It began with confusion, strange echoes on Luftwaffe channels, interference that wasn't there yesterday, pilots mishearing orders, entire squadrons diverting the wrong way, only to find themselves in Allied airspace, alone and outnumbered. Some thought it was just technical failure. Others blamed faulty maintenance. But the truth was more insidious. The Allies had learned to jam. They weren't just communicating, they were silencing. Aircraft from the 8th Air Force began using frequency jamming devices. Some were simple white noise generators. Others were far more complex, designed to mimic German signals and inject false information. One British development, known as airborne cigar, allowed operators to sit inside bombers and broadcast continuous countersignals directly into German air control frequencies. From thousands of feet above, Allied crews were disrupting the very command structure of the Luftwaffe. Pilots began to report chilling experiences, voices that sounded familiar, but gave strange instructions. Entire formations receiving orders that contradicted mission plans. In one confirmed instance, a group of German fighters aborted their attack run after receiving what they believed was a retreat order. It had been faked by a British transmission. And then came the ghosts. The Allies began a new phase of psychological disruption. They called it spoofing, using recorded German voices, captured codes, and real Luftwaffe call signs. They inserted themselves directly into enemy conversations. What followed was chaos, orders questioned, conflicts of command, delays, distrust. The sky was no longer just dangerous, it was deceptive. Inside Luftwaffe communications rooms, panic spread. Technicians began scrubbing, frequencies switching channels, increasing encryption. But it was a losing game. The Allies had cracked the rhythm. Every time the Germans shifted, the Allies adapted faster. It wasn't a war of firepower anymore. It was a war of reaction time. What the Germans didn't understand was that this wasn't random. The Allied approach was methodical. Each transmission, each jamming pulse, was part of a larger strategy known as electronic warfare, though that term would only be fully recognized decades later. In practice, it meant turning the very air around the enemy into a hostile environment, not by shooting it, but by manipulating it. During the bombing campaign over the Ruhr, American B-24 formations reported nearly perfect navigational alignment using systems like G and oboe, while simultaneously jamming German radar systems known as Würzburg. The Germans were staring at blank screens, and all the while, above their heads, thousands of aircraft flew with impunity. It was no longer a battle of sight. It was a battle of signal. In one particularly revealing case, an Allied operation used deceptive radio traffic to make the Germans believe a massive bombing run was headed for Frankfurt. Luftwaffe fighters scrambled east to intercept, but the real attack hit Stuttgart. With the defenders too far to react, the city suffered devastating losses. The German command only realized the trick hours later, and by then, it was too late. This kind of warfare terrified the German leadership, because they couldn't measure it, couldn't predict it, couldn't stop it. Every answer led to another failure. Every solution became obsolete within weeks. Their pilots, who had once relied on instinct and vision, now questioned every voice, every command, every signal in their ear. But perhaps the most devastating part was not the confusion. It was the doubt. When a soldier cannot trust the voice of his commander, he becomes isolated, not physically, but mentally. And in the air, isolation is death. The Germans began to deploy visual confirmation systems, flares, wing waggles, Morse blinks. They reverted to primitive methods to confirm authenticity, but in doing so, they moved backward in a war that was moving forward at the speed of sound. One Luftwaffe officer wrote in his post-war memoir, "We could still fly, we could still shoot, but we no longer knew who was speaking to us, and that made us slow, that made us weak." It's hard to describe the psychological weight of that, to fight a war where you hear your own language, your own commands, but don't know if they are real. To fly a mission wondering if the voice in your ear is your comrade or your enemy. That is what the Allies had built. Not a wall of metal, not a new bomb, but a fog. A digital, linguistic, psychological fog that turned the German sky into a hall of mirrors. And through that fog, the American voice remained unchanged, calm, coordinated, confident, not because of magic, but because of doctrine, because of infrastructure. Because every pilot, every operator, every technician understood not just what they were saying, but why. In the end, the Germans were not just fighting aircraft, they were fighting information. If this perspective opened your eyes to a part of history rarely told, consider sharing your thoughts in the comments. And if you believe that control of the invisible is just as powerful as control of the visible, be part of our mission by subscribing. Because, sometimes the most dangerous weapons are the ones that leave no crater, only silence. The cockpit was never silent. Not truly. Even when the engine noise faded into the background, even when the flak stopped bursting around the fuselage, there was always something. The static, the pulse, the soft rhythmic breath of a machine that never slept. The radio was not just a device bolted to a panel, it was a presence. For American pilots in World War II, it was their compass, their lifeline, and in many cases their only companion between life and death. Flying deep over enemy territory, the voice on the radio became more than information. It became certainty. Imagine being 24 years old, in the cramped seat of a P-51 Mustang, 20,000 feet above Germany. You have fuel for one shot at your target and no room for mistakes. The sky is cluttered with smoke trails and flashing light. But then, through the headset, you hear it, your squadron leader's voice, calm, focused, not yelling, not guessing, just instructions, direct and alive. Adjust bearing to 190. Target has shifted east by 1 click. Maintain altitude. Prepare to dive in sequence. It was like flying inside a mind larger than your own, a collective intelligence formed by hundreds of voices, all trained, all disciplined, all moving as one. That was the power of American air communication. And it wasn't just about coordination, it was about emotional stability. In moments of chaos, when tracer rounds sliced through the sky and enemy fighters closed in at impossible angles, the voice on the radio reminded the pilot that he was not alone. Even when vision was blinded by smoke or darkness, the voice could guide. When morale was shaking, the voice could stabilize. And when the mission seemed lost, the voice could recover it. There is a haunting truth in what many German pilots described after the war. They were not afraid of American firepower. They had faced that before. What terrified them was that the Americans were never truly isolated. They spoke to each other in the middle of combat as if they were in a room, calmly passing updates while flying at 400 miles per hour. Even when the Americans were outnumbered, they sounded in control. This perception became a weapon in itself. German formations, which relied heavily on visual contact and radio discipline, began to fray under pressure. In the heat of battle, Luftwaffe pilots often had to rely on hand signals, prearranged maneuvers, or guesswork. But the Americans adapted mid-air. They changed targets, adjusted tactics, and coordinated their attacks in real time, and all of it flowed through the radio. One mission report from the 352nd Fighter Group describes an encounter over Leipzig, where a group of Mustangs intercepted a larger formation of German Bf-109s. Outgunned and outnumbered, the Americans used their communication to perfection. They split into 2 flights, feigned retreat, looped behind the enemy, and neutralized 7 aircraft in under 4 minutes. Every move was called out over radio. Every adjustment was acknowledged. No confusion, no hesitation. They moved like one body, but thought with many minds. It went beyond fighter combat. The radio transformed the very nature of bombing operations. Flying fortresses were not just slow giants dragging through the sky. They were hubs of coordination. A single B-17 might carry 10 men, but once airborne, it was plugged into a grid of hundreds of other bombers. Each aircraft had a radio operator. Each crew member had defined protocols, and all of them could adapt in real time. If one target was obscured by weather, they would shift. If one aircraft was hit, nearby crews would close the gap. If enemy fighters approached, fighter escorts would be redirected immediately. And yet what made it terrifying to the enemy was not just that they could respond, but how calmly they did it. German civilians in occupied territories sometimes tuned into Allied air traffic by mistake. What they heard stayed with them for years. Clear voices, confident tones, instructions being passed mid-mission without a hint of panic. One French resistance member who had intercepted such a broadcast later said, "It was like listening to people walking through a fire without raising their voices." That calm, that coordination became a myth of its own. It made American airmen feel superhuman to their enemies, not because they were better pilots, but because they sounded untouchable. They sounded like victory, and it was no accident. American training emphasized not just flying and shooting, but speaking. New recruits were drilled in brevity codes. They were trained to avoid emotional outbursts. They learned to filter chaos through clear, clipped, purposeful words. By the time they reached combat, their voices carried the weight of routine. Even when the world around them was falling apart, the Germans tried to adapt. They improved radio equipment. They experimented with better antennas and clearer microphones. But it wasn't enough, because the Americans didn't just change their tools. They changed their culture. To the Luftwaffe, the radio was a link in the chain. To the Americans, it was the nervous system. This difference went unnoticed by many commanders at first, but by late 1944, its impact was undeniable. Mission after mission failed to intercept Allied bombers. Fighters arrived too late. Targets shifted without warning. The Germans no longer controlled the tempo of the air war. The Allies did, because the Allies could talk, and behind every voice was something far greater. A strategy built on overwhelming infrastructure, relentless standardization, and trust in the system. The voice in the cockpit was not just a voice. It was the echo of 1,000 factories, schools, and assembly lines. It was the whisper of a nation that had turned communication into command. That realization broke something inside the Luftwaffe. When the German sky was filled with American aircraft, it wasn't just the roar of engines that filled the air. It was voices, hundreds of them, uninterrupted, in formation. And to those listening from the ground or inside German cockpits, it sounded like an approaching storm, but not a wild one. A coordinated, unstoppable front. Every strike, every turn, every climb, synchronized like a language the Germans could not speak. And as the war dragged on, many began to understand that the true sound of defeat was not silence. It was order. If you felt something while imagining those voices echoing through the sky, take a second to share your thoughts in the comments. And if you want to hear more about the hidden systems, forgotten technologies, and psychological edges that shaped the greatest conflict in human history, subscribing to this channel helps us bring those stories to light, one voice at a time. When the war finally ended, and the ruins were still smoking, when the skies had gone quiet, and only the ghosts remained above Europe, the interviews began. In cold rooms, in captured bunkers, and in reallocated offices once used by the Luftwaffe, Allied officers sat across from German engineers, technicians, and pilots. What they wanted wasn't just data, it was understanding. And what they received over and over again were quiet admissions. Some came as whispers, others as weary reflections from men who had seen the tide of war shift in ways they could never explain with equations or flight logs. 1. Engineer, former Luftwaffe communications specialist Karl Voss, was asked directly when he first realized the war was lost. He didn't mention a bombing campaign. He didn't speak of the loss of airfields or the destruction of oil plants. He simply replied, without hesitation, "The first time I heard an American radio." It sounded unbelievable at first, but the pattern repeated. Captured officers, particularly those from the technical branches, echoed a common theme. It wasn't just the superior number of aircraft or the overwhelming volume of bombs. It was the clarity, the precision, the terrifying calmness of Allied voices on the airwaves. That, they said, was the moment it became real. The war had shifted, and they were no longer chasing victory. They were merely delaying the inevitable. In dozens of post-war reports now buried in archives across Europe, Allied interrogators recorded these moments of recognition. They would later refer to it unofficially as the radio confession, because that's what it was. A shared unprompted realization among the best minds of the Luftwaffe that the voice in the sky, that clean, unwavering, confident voice, meant something deeper than coordination. It meant defeat. For those who had spent their careers believing in German technical superiority, it was almost a spiritual collapse. Their radios had worked. On paper, they were functional. They had range, encryption, direction finding, but they weren't dependable under pressure. They weren't fast. And worst of all, they weren't part of a system that worked together in real time. They were isolated pieces in a puzzle the Allies had already completed. The American voice on the airwaves was not just delivering instructions. It was announcing the arrival of something far more dangerous than firepower: structure. One former radar officer wrote in his private journal, recovered after the war, "It was not the bombers that broke us. It was their silence between the messages, because even the silence felt organized." These were not exaggerations born from defeat. They were observations sharpened by years of service. Men who had once designed cutting-edge aircraft and trained elite squadrons now sat in silence, admitting they had been overtaken by something they could never replicate, not because it was too advanced, but because it was too unified. There was a particularly revealing statement from Major Gerhard Klein, a Luftwaffe flight controller stationed in northern France during the Allied push toward Normandy. He had been monitoring radio traffic for weeks, hoping to intercept patterns, weaknesses, anything that could give his fighters an edge. He wrote later, "They weren't just giving orders, they were listening, adjusting, flowing. We couldn't even get confirmation codes out before their formations had changed. They were water, we were brick." His words captured something that haunted many German veterans after the war. They had come to see themselves not as inferior in skill or engineering, but as trapped in a system too rigid to respond to the war's new tempo. They were playing chess in a game that had become jazz. This realization often came not in the heat of battle, but in moments of eerie calm, listening to the Allied frequencies at night, hearing flights coordinate patrols across the channel, hearing medevac calls, hearing fighter groups respond to a bomber squadron in trouble with speed and precision. It sounded less like war and more like a machine breathing. Some German operators kept logs of Allied radio exchanges just to study the tone. The words were often meaningless to them, coded or in fast English, but the cadence told the story. There was never confusion, never contradiction. Each call was acknowledged, each order executed, every voice part of a choir that had been rehearsed 1,000 times before. That consistency broke morale in a way no bomb ever could. In one documented case, a young Luftwaffe pilot who had survived 3 missions returned to base and requested transfer to ground duty. When asked why, he said, "They always knew where I was. I could hear them coming. I heard them talking. Calm, like they were walking through a park. I was alone." These statements, scattered across interrogation files, diaries, and unpublished notes, form a haunting mosaic of psychological collapse. The Germans had not been outgunned at first. They had been out-heard. They began to fear the very sound of the Allied voice, not because it shouted, but because it never needed to. When intercepted, it didn't waver. When challenged, it didn't stutter. It simply moved forward, uninterrupted, and in that movement, it exposed the cracks in the German war machine. Not the planes, not the tanks, but the communication, the culture of solo brilliance instead of collective execution. American veterans often underestimated the effect their radios had on the enemy. For them, it was just a tool, a standard, a piece of equipment they trusted. They never saw the faces on the other side of the frequency, the engineers silently listening, slowly unraveling, realizing that their world of knobs and wires had been eclipsed by networks and voices. In a war that often glorifies noise, fire, and destruction, it is easy to forget the power of what is not seen. But for those who truly lived it, what echoed longest after the guns went silent was not the memory of explosions. It was that voice, steady, focused, relentless. If this part of the story gave you a deeper understanding of how even the most subtle elements can shape history, feel free to leave a comment below. And if these forgotten confessions, these overlooked moments of clarity interest you, subscribing helps us keep telling the stories that deserve to be remembered, even when they arrive in silence. May 1945. The war was over. The Luftwaffe no longer existed. The proud wings of Germany's once feared air force had been grounded, not by flames, not by some final, cinematic clash in the skies, but by something quieter, something that could not be shot down. In the last days of the conflict, the German airwaves were filled with nothing but silence. The once crowded frequencies, where pilots had shouted positions, ground crews had relayed orders, and scrambled voices had called for fuel, support, or mercy, had gone cold. In the static-laced quiet that replaced them, there was no glory, no drama, just the emptiness that follows understanding, because by then, they all knew. The final sound many Luftwaffe operators heard before their sets went dead was not a German voice. It was English, clear, calm, uninterrupted. American aircraft still filled the skies, and with them came the voices, instructions, coordinates, check-ins, landing orders, business as usual, as if the war had never even slowed them down. There was something deeply symbolic in that. While Germany's infrastructure lay in ruins, and her engineers sat in silence, America's war machine had not paused. It had simply kept moving. The radios kept humming. The voices kept guiding. The skies, once fiercely contested, had been claimed. One German technician, interviewed years later, reflected on those final moments with striking honesty. It wasn't the silence that broke me. It was knowing they were still talking. For those who had survived in the Luftwaffe, not just the pilots, but the mechanics, the radio officers, the engineers, there was no single moment of collapse. There was no massive explosion or siren that signaled the end. It came instead like a shadow growing over time, a slow erosion of certainty, a day-by-day unraveling of control. And at the center of that unraveling was the American voice, constant, confident, and always connected. As the Allies advanced on every front, some German units continued to resist, but in the air the battle was already over, not because every aircraft had been destroyed, but because the network that sustained them had disintegrated, and the Luftwaffe, built on brilliant machines but fractured systems, had no way to rebuild it fast enough. Their strength had been in the plane. The Americans' strength had always been in the system. There was a deeper lesson in that, a lesson many only understood when it was too late. Warfare in the 20th century was no longer about who had the best individual weapon. It was about who could integrate, who could coordinate, who could make 10,000 moving parts act with the speed and simplicity of one. The Allies had made the sky speak. The Germans had only made it fly. And once that shift became visible, there was no turning back. The American pilots who flew in the final months of the war never saw themselves as mythic figures. Most were boys who had barely started shaving when they climbed into a cockpit. But when they spoke, when they pressed the transmitter switch and gave a calm update over France, or Belgium, or the outskirts of Berlin, they were not just voices. They were representatives of something far larger. Each voice carried the weight of a nation's industrial strength, its doctrine, its precision, and its belief in the power of collective action. In those final days, when they called out headings, or altitude corrections, or mission confirmations, they weren't just coordinating missions, they were announcing the future. And the future was organized. It was fast, scalable, resilient. It had a voice, and that voice belonged to America. In the years after the war, many former enemies admitted a difficult truth, that their fear had not come from the sound of machine guns or the roar of engines. It came from the radio, from the cold realization that, no matter how brave or skilled they had been fighting alone, and their enemy had never been alone, not even for a second. By the time the static settled in May 1945, the message had already been delivered, without needing to shout, without needing to warn, without needing to say goodbye. Because in that final silence, the American voice still echoed, and the world was already listening. Thank you for watching this story until the very end. If it resonated with you, if you felt the weight of those invisible signals and the human voices behind them, let us know your thoughts in the comments. Your voice matters too, and if you want to continue exploring the forgotten echoes of World War II, click on the next video appearing on your screen. We are honored to have your attention, and deeply grateful to share these stories with you. History is not just written in battles. Sometimes it is whispered in between.